So I watched the interview with PBD and Netanyahu, and I wanted to come on and do the next big thing that I saw from PBD, which is his appearance on Surrounded. It was one capitalist versus 20 anti-capitalists. And I thought that this was a really good debate, and it actually has me thinking about a lot of the different topics that came up throughout this debate. What I will say is that this debate wasn't as crazy as the Amanda Seales debate, but it did bring up a lot of topics that were highly controversial as far as what people actually said, and then also people's reactions to different things that PBD himself said. One thing that I noticed is that a lot of people are saying throughout the debate that PBD didn't really seem to understand what socialism was and communism was. So I guess from that perspective, he wasn't properly explaining or defending why he believes that capitalism is the best economy or the best form of economy in the world today. Basically, I think that a lot of people who are either living in poverty or below the national average salary, which for 2024 was $63K. So how I would say this is that people want to basically limit the amount of money that one person can make while still being able to make as much money as they can in a capitalist society. So in other words, I think that people want people like Jeff Bezos and Mark Zuckerberg and also Elon Musk to be able to create the ideas that they have, but not necessarily benefit from it the way that they have. So they would not be able to be the millionaires and billionaires that they are today if we had a completely different economic system to where they can just contribute the ideas, but they get paid the same amount of money as anyone else working in America. This is Hey Brittany. Welcome back. Alrighty, so my overall thoughts on this debate. So I thought that PBD did a good job of being respectful and fair of everyone else. However, there was a lot of over talking, so I hate it when they don't just let people talk and finish their point and then interject. It should be more of a discussion where you listen to the other person, you listen to hear what they say, but then you also are taking notes of what you want to respond to, because I feel like a lot of people came into this debate where they were making these really long points, and it was really difficult to respond to any one point of what they said because there was so much information given. And so in that sense, it felt more like a lecture versus a debate on being able to go back and forth respectfully and share your ideas so that everyone could come to a common understanding of what the pros and cons were of the claims that were made. And one thing that was pretty crazy was that PBD made a lot of offers during this debate, which I thought that's probably the most that I've seen, because I've only seen maybe 3 or 4 debates at this point, and he gave, I think, 3 or 4 people offers. So the first person, he gave a like, hey, do you want me to recommend you some books to read? Then he gave somebody a legitimate, I guess, job offer that person crazily turned down. So this was a person who basically said that they work 80 hours a week and they've applied to 477 jobs. They haven't heard back from any of them. And so PBD was like, hey, what's on your resume? What are you doing wrong, basically, that you're not getting a call back from any one of these 477 companies? Then he said, hey, what about you come down for an interview and I give you a job? And so the guy gave his background. It sounds like he basically might be in the trucking industry. I'm not 100% sure. I just assumed from what he told PBD about his transportation logistics background that he is either in trucking or warehouse work, whatever. To me, that indicated, hey, you can be his driver or something like that, right? And so he didn't really react to that, I guess, offer as someone who truly wants to take advantage of any better opportunities that he can find, especially if he does seem really kind of down and out about the opportunities that he has based on his background that he shared. So I was really surprised by his kind of attitude when that offer was presented to him, because he didn't seem grateful and he didn't seem appreciative. And so I don't know if he thought it wasn't a genuine offer and it was just like a hypothetical. He was kind of just like, yeah, sure, okay, whatever. And so if you want to truly better your life, make as much money as you can, and someone who is a millionaire is offering you a job, you should at least be very interested in going through the interview process so that you can learn as much as you can about the opportunity and whether or not you even want to take the job. And so that was just crazy to see someone react so casually to what a lot of people would see as a good opportunity and want to jump at that. So like, if I were debating candidates, not that I would ever be debating Candace Owens and she offered me a job, the debate would be over. I would be ready to set up that interview so that we could work forward towards the next steps. Like, I would be grateful for that opportunity. I wouldn't just be like, oh, I'll see if that's something that I'm interested in. Like, I wouldn't be playing cool about it. I would be grateful for the opportunity. And so that was definitely a missed opportunity for that guy from Texas who was in this situation. And then we had him offer a girl a one-way ticket to a communist party. And then a lot of people are saying that the communist parties that were named were not true communist countries. And so that kind of wasn't quite what the girl was going for, what she would have been looking for anyway. I'm not 100% sure, but a lot of people are saying online they don't think that girl would actually go to a communist party. A lot of these people, they're just debating theories and not really like lived experiences. Like, I don't know if anyone truly wants to go live in a country that is different, completely different from America, because like PBD was saying, we have a line of people wanting to get into America because of the opportunities that are here, because we have freedom of speech, because we have different industries and different markets that you can potentially work in. There just seems like there is a greater sense of control over your future, over your job, because if you don't like one job, you can absolutely go and get another one. Now, are you in a position to be able to just quit your job while you look for another one? Maybe not, but the freedom is there to do that. You just have to make the sacrifice on what's more important to you. Do you want to continue working this job just because it pays your bills, or do you want to quit because it's not in line with your moral values and then look for something better? And so those were a lot of conversations that kept coming up throughout this debate. However, one thing that kept coming up was, people have to work 5 jobs just to survive. And I didn't really like that narrative that was being set up, that the people who work the hardest should be paid the most. And I don't think hard work necessarily equals value, because I played on a basketball team and you had the star players, we had the role players, and then we had the people who didn't play. And you can be hardworking and still not get the rewards or the benefits that you think that you should get. But at the same time, I don't think that hard work is necessarily representative of the salaries that you should earn. Like, everyone should try to do a good job and do it to the best of their ability. And just because you think you are a hard worker or you work hard, I don't think that necessarily translates across different roles in terms of what hard work looks like. Like, if you're doing hard labor, that's going to be a physically stressful job in terms of what you have to put your body through in order to complete the task that are involved in those roles, but that doesn't necessarily equate to the mental hard work that someone has to do to code or anything like that. And so hard work is not the same across different roles. And so I think that also is kind of lost in this conversation, that you should just reward the people who are the hardest working. Well, what does it mean to be a hard worker? And I also think that, yes, we have people who work hard. It's also become about working smarter so that you can get more done in the least amount of time, not necessarily struggling all 8 hours of your day to get your job done. So I think that there is a lot more to this discussion. Okay, so let's get into the claims. So we have 4 claims, and we have 4 claims plus the 10-minute claim of the debater's choice at the end. So the first claim is, incentive is the engine of capitalism, remove it and the system fails. So I actually struggled with this one because I wanted to know more about what an incentive was. And so an incentive is a thing that motivates or encourages one to do something, typically by offering a reward or a benefit. So here they're talking about a profit incentive to do something. So you do something, in other words, to earn money or to generate money. And so they were really clashing here with the idea of people needing to work for incentive. The biggest incentive is obviously money and social standing, in my opinion. So people are saying, there was one guy who was saying that incentives are basically born out of scarcity, not capitalism. So you work for the things that you don't have. And I think that makes sense, because you need to work in order to get money, and then you need to use that money to buy things that you do not have or things that you want more of. So I don't feel like that counters the claim that was being made. Any reason that you are working is evidence that you need to have a motivation to work in order for capitalism to thrive and succeed and all of that stuff. Because if you have people who just don't want to work, that means that jobs are not going to get filled, roles are not going to get filled, and then you don't have anything to keep the business going. So you have to have some motivation for people to work, and people are always going to work for money because you use money to get other things. And this is something that came up a lot. People are talking about single mothers and other people having to work multiple jobs. PBB basically said that for some women, this is kind of a failure on their end because of the choices that they made. And so I do want to play a clip on someone talking about having to work multiple jobs just to exist.
The primary incentives are either greed, amass as much personal wealth as you possibly can.
You think that's the problem? It's greed?
Yeah, exactly. And
because you're not greedy at all.
And like you said, survival.
Yeah.
Right? So the person, working 5 jobs, that they're doing that so they wouldn't want to do that if they didn't need to survive. But that's such a horrible dystopian world to live in. If someone has to work 5 jobs just to survive.
Okay, so there was a lot that was said there, and I'm not sure how much of it I agree with. So I do agree that no one should have to work 5 jobs to succeed, but why exactly is someone working 5 jobs? Are they working 5 jobs because they want to make as much money as they can, or are they working 5 jobs because each job pays so little that they need the income that comes from all 5 jobs just to be able to have enough income to sustain their lifestyle and to meet their basic needs? So I'm not sure that I like this example because yes, there are people who work multiple jobs. There are multiple rich people, millionaires who have multiple jobs because the whole thing is about generating income and generating passive income so that you don't have to work as hard. And you have to get to a position where you can get to that even level where you don't need to work as many jobs or you don't have to do as much to generate a profit. There are things that are passively working in the background to generate money for you. And so the thing that I have an issue with here is that I don't know that it's necessary that someone has to work 5 jobs in order to survive. I don't even know how it's possible to work 5 jobs in a 24-hour time period. So I don't even know what that person's schedule looks like. Are these part-time jobs or how is that even working? Are you working 2 jobs at once? That's crazy. I know that people have done that, especially during the pandemic where you're not like having to go into the office all day where people can actually see what you're doing. And so I don't know that that is on the system necessarily that someone has to work 5 jobs. I think it's all about you and your needs and what you want for yourself, and that determines what kind of jobs you work and how many jobs you work in order to be able to take care of yourself. And so I think the idea that we are just alive and that we should be, entitled to certain things. Yes, we should have certain things. We should be able to work. We should be able to pursue happiness. We should be able to buy property, and we should also not be forced to do things that we don't want to do in terms of the government making us do those things or other people making us do those things. But I do think that you have the choice whether or not you work, and there's consequences of not working. If you don't work, you don't make money, and if you don't have money, you don't get your bills paid. So my point is, I think that modern society has made it to where we value convenience over learning how to do things for ourselves. And because back in the day it used to be super easy, all you had to do was know how to hunt, how to fish, and you could literally get your own food without needing money. You just needed to find the materials to make a spear, all of that stuff, and then you had to work for the fish. You had to stand in the water and wait for your opportunity to strike and catch fish. And so I think that when you bring money into the equation, that adds that extra step of you being able to get to what you need because you need money. You now need money in order to buy the spear, in order to hunt. You just want things that are more convenient. And I think that is why we have the society that we have now, because cash literally is the root of everything. The other thing that came up was the idea of market rates for a specific job or an industry. And I think that this is pretty fair, especially when you think about there being multiple positions for a specific role within a company. So if you have Chipotle and they have multiple franchises all over the country, because you need so many workers to fill each restaurant, that also drives down the hourly wage for those roles, because you can't pay every Chipotle worker who works in the store a $70K salary. Like, you probably could, but that means that the people at the top would need to make less money in order to be able to pass that money down to the people in the stores. And whether or not people are going to do that, I don't know. That's just a suggestion, an idea. But I think that because you have so many roles that need to be filled, that makes the distribution of money and salary a little bit more difficult just because of how many people are involved at that point. One thing that came up was that America was not really based on a meritocracy, and this is basically the criticism that some people are born into wealth and other people aren't. So some people have an advantage and other people do not. And I don't know if that's necessarily fair to say that just because someone is born into generational wealth that there isn't a meritocracy, because an individual at some point had to work for that money and they got to a point where they amassed so much wealth that they were able to pass it down. But that individual, they still have to go out and generate their own wealth and their own name for themselves. That's why you hear about people who say, hey, I didn't get a trust fund or whatever, and they have to go out into the world and make their own money. And yes, at some point they may be able to rely on the family money, but there are a lot of rich people and millionaires who are like, hey, I'm not leaving anything to my kids. They need to work for it. And so I don't think that just because someone has money that's passed down, that means that people didn't work for that money based on merit. It just means that there is so much wealth that it was able to be passed down. And I don't know that it's necessarily a bad thing that some people have an advantage and other people don't, because even if money wasn't involved, your circumstances in life also matter, because where you're born matters, the people around you matter, and then also the environment that you're in matters. So if you are born into a family that lives in a rural area, you're obviously not going to have the same opportunity as someone who is born in an average family who lives in the city, just because those opportunities are different. And so it's not necessarily about money, but it's just about the opportunities that you have based on who your family members are and the opportunities around you. And I don't think that that's necessarily tied to money. You can have an average life and know a lot of people. That's called networking. And because you know so many people, you're able to create all of these different opportunities for yourself. And I don't think that that's explicitly tied to money. Okay, so we're getting into the kind of crazier part of this conversation. There was a girl named Zena who came up, and she was basically talking about intrinsic incentives, and she was basically talking about passion is also what drives people to do a lot of the jobs that they have and to create innovation and all of that stuff. And to me, she was just saying so much at this point that was hard to follow, but it basically sounded like what she was talking about was a hobby. So there are people who have hobbies, they do things that they're passionate about, and there are people who do hobbies just because it's something they're passionate about. It's not something that they plan to make a profit off of or anything like that. And there's other people who turn their hobbies into things that they can make a profit from. And I don't think that that's bad necessarily, but for people who generally just have a hobby, they have to supplement their hobby with something that actually pays the bill. So like if you have an artist who enjoys painting and they're not making any money from it, yes, they can live a lifestyle where they just paint, they don't have a whole lot of money, they're called a struggling artist in that sense, but if they want to be able to continue painting, they may get a job that pays their bills so that in their spare time they can just paint and do the things that they are passionate about. And so I don't think that people just create things out of passion. I think there is a motivation behind it. Yes, you may want a hobby to distract you from your stressful work life or your stressful family life, and then you may want a hobby because you eventually want to use that for profit. And so I think what we're getting down to is that nobody can just do something because they're passionate about it without money being involved if they want to survive. And I think it came up earlier where someone was talking about people doing charity work as a form of kind of like intrinsic incentive. There are people who volunteer their time and they want to give back by donating their time to charity or helping others who are not as fortunate as they are. And so I think that that's totally fine, and what you get out of that is the personal satisfaction of knowing that you've donated your time. But at the same time, in order for you to be able to do that, you need to have some sort of financial security that you can spend time out of your day doing something like that where you don't earn money from that. And I don't think it's a bad thing if you do spend your time donating to charities or donating your time to charity and you don't have a job or anything like that. You are able to kind of trade, work off your debts. Like, say, for example, if you get a meal at a restaurant, but then you say, hey, I can't pay for this, but I'll do the dishes, you're able to trade and bargain in that way. But for the most part, I don't think that people are able to just do things out of passion without meeting their basic needs. So I think a lot of that is tied into having hobbies and whether or not you at some point plan to change your hobby into something for profit. Moving on to the second claim, capitalism has lifted more people out of poverty than any other system. So I've been thinking on this topic because at first I was like, well, yeah, maybe capitalism has lifted people out of poverty more than any other system, specifically America more than any other country. And so one person brought up the, I think, OECD, and basically that data was saying that the US has higher poverty levels compared to other developed countries. However, the poverty in America is not comparable to poverty in underdeveloped countries. So if you think about poverty in Africa, that is not even in the same ballpark of poverty in America. Poverty in Africa would be way worse, right? So I think that in that sense, it is easier to lift yourself out of poverty in America if you're factoring all of the countries as a whole. But when it comes to developed countries, America has higher poverty levels. And one of the contestants, they made the argument that China was an example of people using communism, I think, and redistributing wealth to lift people out of poverty. And I can't remember the numbers that she gave exactly, but it was like a drastic change. I think maybe from like 60% to like 32% or something like that of a reduction in poverty. And then she was basically talking about other examples where they had different systems other than capitalism to kind of just help the economy thrive and eliminate poverty. And she was talking about how you have capitalistic or other countries, namely America, who have gone in and they've ruined what those countries were trying to do, mainly because they saw socialism and communism as a threat to their way of life. And I think that that is a very valid take, because what a lot of people kept saying was, well, communism or socialism, it didn't have a chance to thrive, or we haven't seen the true form of it because it's been sabotaged or it's been ruined by other countries, other people who haven't wanted to see those systems set up. So in that sense, I do think it is true that in some situations, communism may be the answer. There may be a country that thrives because all of the resources are shared. But I think what I was reading in terms of communism is, or what I was reading in socialism, is that everyone owns everything basically in socialism, but you are still paid or whatever based on the work or the contributions that you give. So it's basically the same as capitalism, but it's just the ownership that is different. And then with communism, everyone owns everything, but you all get equal access to everything. So in a communist society, like going back to Jeff Bezos, in a communist society, he would be able to say, hey, let's start Amazon, but he wouldn't own Amazon. He wouldn't own shares in Amazon. He would likely be paid like $63,000 a year, like the average salary. He wouldn't be allowed to amass the amount of wealth that he had. And so I think in that sense, that's why people want communism, because they want the good ideas that these innovative people have come up with. They just don't want them to be able to amass as much money as they've been able to. And so this leads to the conversation of people who are rich should pay more in taxes. They should be reinvesting in the economy and helping other people who are not struggling just because they don't necessarily need all of that money. And so I think one of the contestants was saying that we don't need billionaires, and anyone who is a billionaire, they should have their wealth redistributed so that it can go back into the economy, because that contestant that I'm talking about, she basically talked about how Elon Musk has enough money that he could eradicate poverty, and obviously he's choosing not to do that. And I don't know if it's fair to say that he's choosing not to do that. It's his money. He can literally do whatever he wants with it. So I don't think anyone who has less money would want someone to come in and tell them, hey, you have more money than this person who's struggling and homeless, so you should give away half of your wealth because you have more. So I think that people are okay with people who have excessive amounts being told that, but the average person wouldn't want to be told that because they don't have enough money to give away. And so I don't think it's fair to expect or demand extremely rich people to do certain things with their money, but you would hope that they would want to give back to the community. And even when you give money to charities and all of that stuff, there's obviously stories of people stealing money from charities and that money not actually going to where it's supposed to go. So there would have to be a new system of redistributing that money from those extremely rich people so it actually gets to the people who need it. Interestingly, the other thing that came up was feminism, and basically PBD was bringing up the point that in terms of capitalism, feminism has hurt capitalism for women because it's told women, hey, you know, if you are on welfare, you can't have a man in the home. If you don't have a man in the home, we'll give you a certain amount of money. And this has hurt the relationships between men and women because now you have single mothers who have multiple kids and who are unable to provide for those kids without working multiple jobs. And so in that sense, yes, it is a choice. You either took welfare or you stayed with your children's father and you created a nuclear family. And so I think in that sense, capitalism is not friendly to single mothers who obviously want to spend time with their children, but they're having to sacrifice that time in order to provide for them. Whereas if you have a nuclear family, the woman, if she has a man around, he can get involved in a capitalistic economy. He can go out there and find a job so that the woman can spend more time with the family, and also she can work, but she doesn't have so much stress on her to provide for the family. Because you literally can't do it all. There are a lot of women who do both, who are a mom and who work, but not everyone is going to be successful at that, especially when you're dealing with people who have a lot less money. And so getting back to the idea of capitalism and whether or not this is actually helping people, one thing that came up was from PBD where he was saying that I think capitalism needs guardrails, but they can't have so many guardrails that it chokes the innovator, because they were saying how there's some industries that are overregulated to the point where not all of, say for example, there are 500 businesses that want to compete in this one industry. If there's so many regulations and all of that stuff, it's not 500 people or 500 businesses competing anymore, it's just one or two. And so that overregulation actually hurts the, I guess, industry or the competition, because a lot of people are not going to be able to break through or work with all of those rules, because they brought up child labor and how basically child labor laws were put into place to say that, hey, you know, children can't work over X number of hours and they must be paid X amount of money, that sort of thing. And so yes, there are some things that need to be regulated and they absolutely should be regulated, but when you have too much regulation, it just makes things difficult for someone to be a business owner and to want to present ideas that they can then profit from. And I really like how PBD brought up this example of Coca-Cola, because they were talking about how there's lead in water and how this is harmful. And so he brought up Coca-Cola and he was saying like, hey, you know, Coca-Cola realized that in order to thrive, they actually have to fix the water crisis. They have to get rid of the lead in the water and all of that stuff. And so when you have countries that are doing well and they want to succeed, they in turn will take care of communities or take care of the environment, because if those things are a blocker to their way of being able to do business, they are going to have to, at some point, address those issues in order to move forward. So there is a social responsibility for really large businesses and corporations to take care of the environment. But I also think that this is problematic because you do have to have ways of holding those businesses accountable if they are harming the communities and harming the environment, so that they take the necessary steps to make changes if their way of doing business is something that had a negative impact on the community and the environment. So I think it goes both ways. Those large companies, they can fix a problem that already exists, or they can create problems and then later have to work to address those problems and fix it in order to restore their brand reputation. Okay, so I want to get into this next clip. So this is basically them talking about homelessness and the minimum wage. The minimum wage or a livable wage did come up multiple times during this debate, but I want to play this one clip.
From California? We haven't had a pay raise since California? 2009.
Do you live
Our
here?
Our minimum wage nationally is $7.25.
Okay.
And you wonder why we have the highest poverty rate. You think that capitalism's winning? Can you survive? Would you like to live off $7.25
I used
an
to
hour?
work for $4.25 at Haagen-Dazs.
Right.
Then I
and that
went
was
and
a
worked
very
at
different time.
Burger King for $4.75.
And how much do you make
Then
now?
I make millions today.
Okay, so there was a lot said in that clip, and so I like that he basically gives the example of, hey, I worked for less than $7.25 an hour when he was working at Haagen-Dazs for I think $4.25 an hour is what he said. And what I noticed is that he didn't really adjust or account for inflation, so I don't know what he was actually making. But the point is, obviously, that was a completely different time and climate, so you could have probably purchased more for $4.25 an hour than you would now today. Obviously, nobody today should work for $4.25 an hour in America, because that is not going to do anything for your standard of living or help you pay a large portion of your bills. Like, that is way too little to be making in terms of a hourly salary. And then the other thing that came up was the idea that we all can't be PBD. And so this is what the girl is arguing. She's saying that we basically don't all have the privilege that you have. We don't have the connections. We don't have the money that you have. And so for a lot of us, this is the best that we can do. And I don't really like that he countered by saying, oh, well, you wouldn't work as hard as me, or you can't, that's why you can't be like me. Because what does it mean to work hard? So for someone like PBD, what does his version of working hard look like at this point of his career? Is it that he spends an hour, 2 hours prepping for an episode, and then he records the episode and then he's done because somebody else might be editing the video? So what exactly is hard work at his level of success? And then for someone else, hard work might be working 40 hours and then overtime to make extra money so that you can pay your bills. So you may end up working a 60-hour week or 80-hour week or something like that. Or you may be doing hard physical labor to where it's just a lot of stress on your body. And obviously it's your choice to do those type of jobs, but it depends on what is available around you. And then if you have the means to move and job hop and go from city to city to find a job that works for you. And so I just didn't really like the idea of him saying, well, you wouldn't work as hard as me, because you have to spell out what it is that you do that you qualify or you quantify as hard work, because when you say hard work, that could just mean anything. So you have to be specific about what you mean, because for basketball players, hard work might be going to practice and then doing an extra 2 hours shooting in the gym, and then maybe do an extra hour or two lifting weights. And so obviously how do you compare that to working an average job to say what it looks like when someone is working hard or they're working harder than other people? And so I think you really have to spell that out, especially across different roles and different occupations. And then the other thing that kept coming up was basically he was saying, like, people don't know how to maximize their value. There's a lot of people who are watching Netflix, they're watching these YouTube videos, which I thought was pretty funny, because obviously he creates YouTube videos and you would want people to watch that. So you're criticizing the people who are watching content that you create by saying that you shouldn't be watching that, and you should be basically finding other ways to use your time so that you can maximize your value, which would lead to you making more money. And so unless you have YouTube videos that are going to help people in the real world as far as getting a job in the workplace, a lot of these videos on YouTube are just for entertainment. But I don't think that you should shame the people who are watching your content, because people are watching your content, one, as a stress reliever so that they have a distraction from family life, work life, or they're just bored and they're trying to fill their time. And yes, there are other ways to fill their time, but I don't think that you should shame people who are watching YouTube, watching video games, and doing whatever else. If they are, because you don't know if in the other spare time that they have, are they actually doing something else to benefit themselves. I think everyone should have an hour, 2 hours, or however many hours you want to de-stress and kind of just cool down from the stress of your day-to-day life. So I don't think that it's necessarily fair to say that people are just spending all day doing stuff. And there are some people who are spending all day playing video games. Those people are streamers who are making a lot of money, right? But there are some people outside of that who are spending a lot of money or spending a lot of time playing video games, and they're not getting any economic value from that. And I think that is a problem. But I think he needs to make a clear distinction here, because you can do some stuff as a hobby and you can do some stuff as a stress reliever, but there are a lot of people who are actively trying to better their station in life, and it's just a matter of whether or not you have the opportunities to do that. You can take a class or you can get a degree in something, but that doesn't automatically mean that you're going to get a high-paying job right away. You're going to have to put in more work to get to that point that you want to get in. So it's just not something that happens instantaneously. And so I think that is something that we should talk about, because you have to quantify or spell out what exactly hard work looks like across all of these different roles and occupations. Moving on to claim 3, if all the money in the world were divided equally, it would return to the same pockets in 5 years. So I've heard different variations of this basic claim to where people say, if you give everyone the same amount of money, basically the people who are rich are going to keep that money, and the people who are poor have never managed that amount of money before are going to lose it. And so I think that this is something that people commonly say is going to happen. If you were to redistribute the money, the rich would just be rich again in a few years, and the poor would be right where they are because they don't know how to manage that money. And so there was a guy, Caleb, and he's kind of basically like a hippie, and he was smart because PBD basically did kind of offer him a job, but he was basically saying, hey, I need to make sure that the job is in alignment with my morals and my values, and that was more understandable because at that point he had very strong principles and he wants whatever work that he does to match his values. So in that sense, I'm not going to say that somebody's being too selective if they have morals. Nobody should have to do jobs that they are morally against in order to survive. Whereas with that other guy, the guy from Texas, he didn't even really go into anything like that. He was just so lackadaisical about his response to the offer that was probably what pissed people off the most, seeing that interaction. So it just seemed like he didn't really appreciate the opportunity or didn't care about it. And so I think Caleb had a much better approach. But then also I think that some people would say, Caleb, okay, you need to get out of that fantasy world that you live in. You need to go get a job. You're a white man in America. You have way more privilege and opportunities than other people who don't look like you. You're just choosing to play games and play around and all of that stuff. I think some people would take that approach, but also understanding that you can live however you want in America, and if you qualify for government assistance and all of that stuff, you should absolutely have it. But I think that there is kind of like disagreement in terms of what people should be doing with their time and how they should be living their lives. And so I think Caleb is a good example of that because obviously he, to me, gives off hippie vibes, and he seems like he lives that sort of kind of flower child lifestyle. And I don't mean any offense when I say that, but I just think that there are different ways that people go about wanting to have a good life and take care of their basic needs. However, I don't necessarily agree with the fact that you can have people who intentionally take lower paying jobs, they get government assistance, and then they say that other people need to give them stuff because they have more. I don't think that Caleb was necessarily saying that, but I think that in general that came up a lot. And so I don't think that that's fair either, because everyone should be responsible for themselves and do the best that they can and maximize their potential to make the most amount of money that they can. And if you are struggling, yes, you get government assistance and all of that stuff. I don't think that people who make more owe anyone else to give money to them to make their lives easier. If they want to donate to charity or if they want to donate their money to people specifically, I think that that is on them and that is their right. And obviously that goes back to how they are raised, how they perceive money, and how they want to contribute to their communities. So just getting back to the claim, so this is obviously speaking to people's money habits, people who've never had that amount of money before. I think the amount of money would be $63,000 per person. And so some people have never had that much money. I'm going to assume that you're giving that money in cash all at one point. So most people have never had that much money in saving. And so what will they do with that money? Some people are going to spend it on their basic needs. Other people are going to spend it on luxury items, things that they don't necessarily need. Some people are going to invest it, and then other people are going to save it the traditional way. And then for the rich people, I think in this example, if I'm putting a lot of thought into this example, but in this example, if rich people only had $63,000 in savings and they were making like the average salary, the millionaire class, I think, would instantly collapse, because then you can't afford your home. You're not going to be able to live the life that you're accustomed to if this is all you have. And so they would have to make changes right away. However, if you're saying in this example that society is exactly as it is, the money is just redistributed. So I would assume Jeff Bezos, for example, all he has is $63,000, but he still owns shares in Amazon. Eventually, yeah, he's going to make all of that money back in 5 years, so it's not going to be a problem for him. It would just be like him starting from scratch when Amazon was first created, but it's obviously different because there was a high kind of rise in profit or a high rise in success and fame for him with Amazon, and you can't always like tap back into that initial rise, if that makes sense. So in that sense, if he had to start all over today, it would look very different, I feel, because it's a completely different time and economy. Now, the other thing that came up was one girl, this was a girl who was saying that she was mentally ill. I think her name was Isabella or Isabel. She didn't think that she was arguing for wealth to be redistributed. She was more so saying that she just wants everybody to have, I guess, access to the basic things that they need. And so in that sense, it got me wondering, so what if we had, instead of like a minimum wage, because I explained why we couldn't really change that, instead of having a minimum wage, what if we had a like kind of like a salary cap where, hey, nobody in America should live below the salary cap, and this is supplemented by the government. So when you do your tax returns and you say, hey, you know, I only made 40K, if the cutoff is 50K, then that person gets 10K because they were under that. But obviously you need to prove like, hey, that you were trying to get a job and all of that stuff, because if in that example I presented, some people would just get 50K from the government without even trying to get a job and all of that stuff, and that's not really fair, I think, is what some people would say. And then some people might just get 5K or 10K, whatever that difference is between 50K. And so I think something like that could be helpful, because then you're not changing the minimum wage, you're not ruining competition, and it's still a free market in that sense, but you're also making sure that everyone kind of has a more even baseline for being able to afford their basic necessities. And then obviously if you make above 50K, then you don't get anything from the government in that example that I gave. I want to dig into the interaction with Isabel a little bit more. So basically she was talking about her mental health and how this prevented her from working. And yes, there are people who have disabilities and they cannot work the way a person who does not have disabilities would be able to. And so yes, I want to acknowledge that there is a hardship in that sense, because I am someone who is disabled. So there are certain jobs that I would not be able to work just because of my hearing loss. That would actually be a safety concern. And so there are some people who have disabilities like that, where they're just not able to work those jobs because of how it would impact other people. So I absolutely understand where she's coming from with that. But this interaction was a little weird, because he did make a good faith offer, I think, to set her up with a specialist who could better examine her and all of that stuff. But then I think he went a little bit too far with how he framed, well, would you go see a psychiatrist that I choose? And she's like, you choose? No, because obviously what type of person would he be choosing? What are the qualifications that he would be looking for? And so in that sense, that is a little weird. So he should have just said, hey, you choose a psychiatrist to see and I'll pay for you to go see them, that sort of thing. I think that would have been a more genuine faith offer to Isabel. And the other thing that I wanted to comment on was, I think he was digging a little bit too much into her mental health history. However, I think he did have a valid point in saying we do have an industry where we try to convince people that something is wrong, so that in turn we can sell them X and we can make a profit off of it. And so I think he was fair to point that out, but the way he did it with this particular girl was a little bit weird. But I do hope that she takes him up on part of his offer, because again, if it was a genuine offer, you should not turn it down just because you don't like this person, or you should at least be curious enough to see what could potentially be the outcome of taking him up on the interview, taking him up on the book recommendations, or taking him up on the offer to pay for your doctor appointments. Moving on to claim 4, the U.S. is more socialist than capitalist today. If you hate the system, you're anti-socialist. And so this was something that I had to look up, because one girl was basically defining communism as a stateless, moneyless, and classless society. But then I was doing some more research, and basically what I was reading is that most economies are a mixed economy. Government oversees some aspects, public utilities, public transportation, public schools, and public libraries. Those are the socialist elements that PBD would be talking about. And so I do think that there is a mixed economy where you can have people who can start their businesses, they can get rich, they can create a business that other people work for, and so on. But then you do have elements of America where those are government run areas of public life, but they are directly responsible for and need to upkeep and maintain, so that people in society can use those utilities. Then they had the attack on billionaires. So this is basically, again, saying billionaires should not have as much money as they have. They should have to donate to, they should have to give away their wealth, basically, and help make other people's lives better. And then also they were talking about how NYC or New York state, I guess, has the most billionaires. I think there are, let me Google. So New York City has 123 billionaires with a combined net worth of 759 billion in 2025. So that is a crazy amount of money. And then there is an area of Manhattan known as Billionaires Row. I lived in New York City for 10 years. I did not know that, but that is crazy. So yeah, so what they were talking about with billionaires is that I can't say his name, the guy who's running for, I think, governor in New York City or whatever, or mayor, something like that, and he wants to basically create like city-owned grocery stores and all of that stuff, so he wants to make it more socialist. And so they were talking about, well, hey, if you run all of the billionaires out of New York, if you don't appreciate them, then you're gonna see what happens to New York. Like, they're gonna lose all of that money that those specific people are paying in taxes, and then New York City is not gonna look like it looks now with those people living there. And then they also gave the example of AOC and I think Amazon, and how Amazon wanted to bring, I think he said 25,000 jobs to New York City, and those people would have been paid 150K. And yes, 150K sounds like a lot, but also there's accounting for living in New York and all of that stuff. And so they were saying that I guess AOC or whoever basically blocked that contract, and so that New York City lost those jobs, and that Amazon went to a different state to give people the opportunity to have access to those jobs. And so basically they were talking about, you need billionaires because they do pay taxes, because at one point he brought up how like the lowest 50%, I guess, in income, they only paid 2% in taxes, whereas the rich, they paid closer to 40%. And so obviously rich people are contributing to taxes. It's just that people think that they should be paying even more because of how much money they have. And again, I don't know if that's fair, because if you make 63K and someone told you, hey, you need to give more of your money because you have so much wealth, I don't think people would be okay with that. So I think it's fine when it happens to other people, but when it happens to you, you're going to have problems with it depending on what the issue is. And so I can understand both sides of the argument. Then the other thing that came up was PBD's job. So he has a life insurance and annuities job. And so basically, I heard other people say that allegedly he was running a Ponzi scheme. I don't know anything about that, but I know that Bernie Madoff was charged with running a Ponzi scheme and all of that stuff. And so basically, he was taking money from other people to pay someone else back, and then just doing that, and then eventually it all collapsed. And so PBD saying, hey, this is not what I'm doing. I sell a product. We have a different business model and all of this stuff. And so I was surprised that the guy brought that up, because he's like, oh, well, this article says that you're doing this. And I think Daily Beast is like a gossip. Let me Google Daily Beast. So I don't know exactly what Daily Beast is. It seems like it's a news website or something like that. It's a news website, and so obviously you can say whatever you want, but he was just taking everything that this news source said as fact, and he could have just used that opportunity to ask him about it. And so that was kind of a weird moment, because you don't want to be accusing people of committing crimes on streaming platforms like this when you don't know all of the facts. And so I thought that was bold to say something like that, because again, if you don't know anything about this guy, you don't know much about what he does, but you're making this allegation based off of what you read, that can be problematic. And so I thought it was good that he kind of clarified, like, hey, this is my business motto. You can't, Ponzi schemes are illegal and all of that stuff. And so he tried to address this, and he was basically pointing out something about CoffeeZilla. I don't know what that is, but he was basically saying that with what he does, I guess his business model is set up so that they can be successful, because I guess only 1 or 2% of people make it in insurance. And so moving on from that, the next thing they came back to is the minimum wage. And so they were talking basically about how smaller businesses are not going to do well if you raise the minimum wage, because they're not going to be able to afford to pay that. And then this would just lead to bigger businesses drawing that talent from those small businesses. And then those small businesses would go out of business because they cannot afford to pay their employees a higher minimum wage. And I thought it was crazy, because this girl presented this idea that the minimum wage should start at $27.87 and then go up if you have kids. And I don't know if it should work like that. Minimum wage should be a set fee that the average person can live on, and whether or not you have kids does not mean that you're entitled to more money. In my opinion, you're supposed to use the money that you get to take care of your kids. You're not supposed to get extra money because you have kids, and I don't know if that's necessarily fair. Let me know what you guys think in the comment section about that. And then I think this whole idea of minimum wage and a livable wage is kind of dumb because they kept bringing it up. Well, are you going to pay minimum wage to your employees, or do you pay a livable wage? And obviously a livable wage depends on what your bills are and what your expenses are. So someone could say that a livable wage for them is $15, and somebody else could say, oh, it's actually $7 because my expenses aren't that high. So it really depends on who you're talking about. In general, he was pressed on how much he pays his employees because he brought up Bernie Sanders saying, hey, the minimum wage should be $15 an hour, but he wasn't paying people $15 an hour based on what PBD was saying, and PBD was saying, hey, nobody on my staff or whatever makes $15 or $20 an hour, meaning they make way more than that. And so I thought it was funny that people are trying to check him and make it seem like he is just paying people minimum wage when he may be paying them a lot more money based on what he said. And so he also talked about how when he is, I guess, hiring for jobs, he considers the market rate and he pays people based on the market rate, and if he has more money, he may go above that because he really wants this person. So he was saying that in a capitalist society, you have the ability to work wherever you want. And if you don't like how someone is treating you at your particular employer, you can go and work for someone else. And I think that is a great thing. But again, what I was saying earlier is not everybody has the means to be able to quit a job and then wait for the next job to come around. So people tend to work a job, and then when they find something better, they leave. And if you're constantly waiting a long time for something better, you're stuck in that one job that you don't like, and so that can be difficult as well. They also brought up the idea of billionaires getting subsidies, and they were talking about basically how we don't really have a say in where our tax dollars go. And so PBD was really trying to point out, like, hey, you vote for the people that best reflect your interest, and then those people in Congress, they are the ones who dictate where your tax dollars go. And I think that is very valid because people think that one thing from the recent election that I read about was that basically we vote for people to go to Congress, and then those people are making their own decisions based on the average, I guess, wants and needs of their constituents. So it may not be exactly what you want, but those are the people who are actually voting for the things that they think we want, and so on. And so we don't have a direct say in where our tax dollars go. And I know that in other countries, they have a breakdown to show you exactly where your tax dollars are going, or you can choose where you want your tax dollars to go. And I think it would be cool to have something like that, but then you would probably have people selecting the same things, and so that means that other areas of public life would be underfunded because everyone wants their tax dollars to go to a specific organization or a specific sector of life. Okay, moving on to claim 5. So this is Mason's claim: America has never been a meritocracy. And so I really like this example, and I'm going to play a clip of them talking about this.
Do I think a nurse is more important to the market than a basketball player? Yes. But the market wants to watch a basketball player play, so they pay Steph Curry $60 million a year.
We both agree that America's failing, right? Your last claim was about how America's socialist, and that's a bad thing. I assume that you're saying because of government intervention. Is
Absolutely.
That correct? So you think capitalism can exist without government intervention?
I think you need law and order because there will be abuse if you don't have it.
Okay, so I really like this clip because he is acknowledging that, yes, a nurse is more important than a basketball player, and people have had these conversations over social media and all of that stuff, and saying that, athletes and all of that stuff are really well paid, but should they be as well paid as they are? And this especially came out when I think it was either Messi or Ronaldo, and they were getting paid $1 billion, and that's crazy because you're literally just getting paid $1 billion to kick a soccer ball. Yes, some jobs are more important than others, but it's also about the market around your industry, and people are choosing to spend their money to go to basketball games, to watch NBA League Pass and all of that stuff, and to watch the different sports. And so you can't dictate what people spend their money on because in turn with people spending their money to watch all of these different pro sports, that is making money for those organizations and those owners. And that's not anything that you can really do anything about. You can't control what people do in their free time and where they want to spend their money. And so in that sense, that's not really going to change how nurses get paid or how people in other roles that are really important to our economy and our communities get paid, because that's a completely different market. And so what I want to talk about now is to continue on the topic of NBA players, and I also want to bring in Chipotle. So he talked about how Stephen Curry makes a lot of money, and so getting back to what I was saying earlier, Chipotle relies on people who run their stores in order to even be able to make a profit. So if you don't have people to work in your restaurant, your restaurant can't serve food. And I was also talking about how Chipotle headquarters, they have limited roles, and so those people are going to make more money. They don't have to pay as many people at specific positions, and so that allows those people who work in the office to make more money than the people who make in the stores. Now, the NBA functions in a different way. They only have 400-ish players in the NBA, and as much money as the NBA makes as an organization, each team also makes money as well. And so that is why, because they only have 400 players, they're able to pay these athletes so much more money than you would see in a traditional business. So going back to Chipotle has, let me see how many restaurants Chipotle has. Chipotle has over 3,700 restaurants in the United States, so they cannot pay every single employee who works in a restaurant a $70,000 salary, but with something like the NBA, they can pay these players millions of dollars because there's only 400 of them, and so that makes it easier for these people to make a whole lot more money. And so it would be very different if the NBA had 400 players at each position, because then the wealth is not going to be distributed more equally, but there's so many more people that they need to pay. They would not be able to pay one player so much money. And so when you have franchises or you have multiple stores of one particular business and you need people to work at all of those stores and locations, that dilutes the money that people are going to be able to earn for those positions, which I think is kind of what the market value is all about and all of that stuff. And so I think it does, even though it sucks that certain industries and certain roles within our communities are undervalued in terms of what they are paid, it's also about where people want to spend their money and what those businesses are that are getting those people's money. And so it's just an interesting thing to think about, but that's where I wanted to end for this video. There's definitely a lot of good stuff that was talked about in this debate. Alrighty, so just wrapping up this episode, I thought that this was a really good discussion. A lot of good things came out in terms of what I learned and made me think about things in a slightly different way than what I was thinking when I came into watching this debate. I did watch it twice. I watched it the first time while I was doing something else, so I couldn't completely pay attention, and then I wanted to watch it a second time while I took my notes for this video. But I do think that this was an overall productive conversation, and it should really get people thinking about capitalism, socialism, and communism and what economy they want to live in. I think a lot of people do want to be able to make as much money as they can, and if you were raised right, you do want to contribute to your communities, you do want to make a difference, and you do want to help the lives of people around you. But I also think that we can't force people to do things. We have to, I guess, hope that people do the right thing and want to give back to the community. I know that Jeff Bezos' ex-wife, she's donated like probably over $1 billion, and so she's doing a lot of good work, and hopefully that money is getting where it needs to go and all of that good stuff. So yeah, let me know what your thoughts are about this debate. Do you guys have any opinions or comments on capitalism, socialism, or communism? Let me know in the comment section below. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.